morning, everybody. Today's speaker really needs no introduction. He's a familiar name and face to probably many of us in this room. With more than 40 years of service to his country, he's a combat veteran of the Vietnam War, where he flew more than 170 combat missions in Southeast Asia in the F-4. He later flew the F-15 aircraft, the air-to-air models, as well as the multi-role F-15E. During his active duty career, he served as an instructor at the prestigious Fighter Weapons School. He served as a squadron and a group commander, and on more than one occasion as wing vice commander. Following his retirement from active duty, he wrote and edited various Air Force history projects before serving as an air and space strategist for Project Checkmate. In 2003, he became a member of the Senior Executive Service and served as the director of the Air Force History and Museums Policies and Programs, a position he held until his retirement from the Senior Executive Service after the end of 2012. He's the author of numerous studies and reports and of two popular volumes, The Ash Warriors and Sierra Hotel, the latter of which has a memorable appendix on the true story of Jeremiah Weed. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our guest speaker, Dick Anderegg.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Jeremiah Weed follows me wherever I go. In fact, someone just said in the middle of your presentation, I'm going to stand up and yell, "Tell the true story of Jeremiah Weed." I'm not going to do that, but I will tell you how it got written. I was writing Sierra Hotel under a contract with what was then Air Force XO, now Air Force A3. He called me into his office one day. He says, "I've got this book I want you to write, and here's the story of this book." And he said, "I think, I read your first book, and I really liked the way you did that. So I started writing this book." And I had deliverables, one a month. And when I sent my deliverable in, they sent me a paycheck. I sent my deliverable in, they sent me a paycheck. And there was some sort of it had to be 20 pages, or I can't remember what it was. There was some amount that it had to be, whether it was good or bad. And so I was sitting one night, I was about halfway through the book, and I was sitting one night, and I had my glass of scotch beside me on the computer, sitting beside the computer, and I, once again, like many of you have done, go total writer's block. I had no idea what the point of what I was writing was. I just didn't know where the hell I was going with this. And I had interviewed a guy for the book who also, during the course of the interview, he and I were yucking it up about the story of Jeremiah Weed. And he had told me this story on tape. And I had my notes, and I hit period at the end of what I was writing, which was at that point about 3 pages short of what I needed to get paid. And I went back to my notes, and I went, Appendix 1, the true story of Jeremiah Weed. And from that, I wrote that, and it made my 20 pages, and I sent it in. And believe me, I never gave it another thought after that. It took about a year before the book actually came out. And by that time, I was working over at the Warrior Prep Center in Einsiedlerhof, right outside of Ramstein Air Base, on a contract writing as a writer on the Air War over Serbia report. And somebody came up to me and said, "Hey, I just saw on the internet your book is out." And I said, "Really? That's great. How do you know?" He said, "Because I just read the true story of Jeremiah Weed." And in that book was not on the street an hour before somebody had gone to a copier, a scanner, and put it down and scanned the true story of Jeremiah Weed, Appendix 1, and sent it out to all their friends who went to all their friends who went to all their friends who went to all their friends. If I could do if I could be an advertising guy and be able to do that for movies that are coming out or books coming out, I'd be a multi-millionaire right now, because it was the greatest publicity I could have ever had. I have one excellent piece of news for you. There is a screen there, but there are no PowerPoints in my talk this morning. None, not one single one. Not even one that says there are no PowerPoints. So we'll jump right into it. In the decade after Vietnam, the Air Force fighter force went under huge sweeping changes. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about this morning. And those sweeping changes can be generally categorized into training, weapons, and aircraft that changed in that decade from about 1974 to from the mid 70s to the mid 80s. And these changed everything in the Air Force fighter force. I mean, it changed everything. The way we did things, whatever. Well, what was the motivation for that? Well, it certainly wasn't because we thought we'd lost the war, because I'll tell you right now, and I'll speak about this just a little bit later, we had one-year tours. And, I've heard many guys say, hey, we were winning when I was there. How'd you guys screw it up after I left? It was going great when I was there. I never met one of my contemporaries that ever thought that they hadn't done as good a job as they could do. But they had some real obstacles to overcome. And the sarcastic side of me would say we had the wrong weapons, we had the wrong aircraft, and we had the wrong training. But other than that, we did pretty good, Well, why did we have the wrong weapons, the wrong aircraft, and the wrong training? Because in the early 60s, in the Kennedy administration, the McNamara whiz kids had formed our force, and they had designed and formed our force to be a nuclear force. Not only the bombers and the missiles, but also the fighters. All right, so our aircraft were designed to be part of the mutually assured destruction piece that was all part of massive retaliation as a national military policy. And because there was not any thought, or very little thought, and when I say thought, that means thought equals funding, right? There was no funding. We had good nuclear forces. We had really very little conventional power. And I'll give you some examples. The F-4 and the F-105. The two workhorses of the air war over North Vietnam later on. The F-4 was designed to be a high-altitude interceptor to protect the fleet from Soviet bombers coming to drop nuclear bombs on the U.S. Navy. That's what it was designed for. Big frickin' radar in the nose of it, see a long ways, and it had radar missiles on it that were designed to go a long ways and shoot down these large, high-altitude, non-maneuvering targets. You can see where I'm going right away, right? Okay. The F-105 was designed to go low and fast. It had a bomb bay, a fighter with a bomb bay, F-105 with a bomb bay, to deliver single nuclear weapons wherever needed, mostly in the European theater. And many, many F-105s were stationed over in Europe, and they sat nuclear alert with their one bomb. So they were designed to go low and fast. That meant they were sleek, and they were fast. And the F-105 was as fast on the deck as anything we ever had in our Air Force until the F-111 came along. But it was a scooting machine at low altitude. 1,000 miles an hour was common for that airplane on the deck. All right? So when it didn't have anything on it. But i.e. leaving the target. I tell you, those boys could get out of a target fast, and they did. But what do you get in that kind of a design? You get the thin, real swept-back wings. You get the very aerodynamic canopy that ends right behind the pilot, like this. So you have what's called aerodynamically high wing loading. In other words, weight of the aircraft divided into how much the wings can support, which means that it can't turn. Go in a straight line really fast, but it can't turn. And just from the pilot point of view, you can't see out of it except to the side and the front. And I'm going to make this point later on, but we'll just talk about that. I'm a former fighter pilot, so I have to talk with my hands. I have to wave things around. For those of you who haven't been in a fighter or flown a fighter, think about a fighter dogfighting. the pilot is seldom looking out the front of the airplane. And that doesn't mean he's being attacked from behind. But just consider that if I'm flying like this and I want to go over there and attack that guy, I roll the airplane like this. Now where am I looking? I'm looking out the top of the canopy, right? And if this guy is going that way and I'm going this way, just like in the movie in Top Gun, as he goes deeper around behind me like this and I'm turning, now I'm looking out the back of the canopy, right? So these airplanes were not designed at all in any way, shape, or form for the kind of dogfighting mission that would happen when they got into combat over North Vietnam. The weapons, the AIM-7, the primary weapons, the AIM-7 and the was the B model. Now we're up to like the November, I guess, but AIM-7s, the very first models, were meant to fire straight, go way out there, long ways away, reach out and touch somebody, non-maneuvering, big altitude target. The heat seekers, which are unfortunately named heat seekers because they're really not heat seekers, they're infrared trackers, were also meant to do the same thing, be shot at non-maneuvering, high altitude, big targets. And guess what? In the case of the F-4, no gun. Doesn't need a gun. You're going to go out and shoot bombers at high altitude, you don't need a gun. So it didn't have one. It wasn't just the air-to-air weapons that were remiss for our mission over North Vietnam, and in South Vietnam actually for that matter, but also the ordnance that we had on the airplane. We had actually World War II design iron bombs. That was it. We didn't actually even have when we started any cluster munitions. We had no anti-armor munitions. We had very, very, very slim pickings. Essentially, you flew mission after mission after mission after mission for years and years and years with a World War II 500-pound or a World War II 750-pound bombs, some number of them depending on your aircraft and your mission, loaded on the airplane. It is very difficult to hit from a 45-degree bomb pass, dropping at 10,000 feet above the ground, a thing that's on the ground within 300 feet. Bombing accuracies, we know from many different sources, bombing accuracies in World War II were about 3,000 feet, and in Vietnam they were somewhere on the order of 350 feet. Now I say 350 feet, and you think the length of a football field. Well, consider the fact that to kill a truck with a Mark 82 500-pound bomb, you have to hit within 15 feet of it. So it's a factor of 20 off, right? Okay, so it wasn't just that. And cluster munitions didn't come along until later. We did actually start to develop cluster munitions in the mid-60s. And we did have one in 1965, 66, and 67 that could be delivered straight and level at 200 feet above the ground. Now, I'm here to testify that wasn't any fun at all, okay? All right, so the air-to-air and the air-to-ground weapons. I'll give you one more example in the F-4. Remember I said we're always looking out the top and the back of the canopy as we're maneuvering in these dogfights? The switches that changed your weapons release between radar missiles, heat missiles, and no gun, but radar and heat missiles, was right here in front of your left knee. And there were 4 little switches that were just about the size of the end of my little finger, right? So here I am, and I've got radar missiles selected, and I go into this merge with a MiG, and I'm pulling 5.5 or 6 Gs coming back. I'm looking on the top, and I say I need a heat missile select. How do I do that? First off, I've got my hands braced against the canopy so I can push myself back against this turning force. And now I've got to reach down here, and someplace out there in front of me are those 4 silver switches. The third of one from the left is the one I've got to move. Fighter pilots are inventive, if nothing else, excuse me. They use these plastic tubes in maintenance to stick up onto a nipple on the bottom of the engine to drain engine oil out to check the oil samples for metal filings. And they're about this long. And we used to take one and take our survival knife out and cut 3 inches off the end of that tube. And that tube would fit exactly over that silver switch. And then in the fight, you could reach down and you could actually slap that plastic tube and down, and it would change the missile selecting that you had. Okay, so that's what we were working with. Of course, if you were flying straight and level against a bomber at 40,000 feet, you could probably look down and change those switches, but you couldn't do it in a dogfight. All right, so having that kind of experience, thanks, Jim. Having that kind of experience with the aircraft and the weaponry, we've heard many historians and many leaders in the military say many, many times over, it's not the bombs and bullets that win the wars, it's the people. Let's talk a little bit about the people. First off, at the start of the war, 1965, they were highly experienced. If you ask a pilot, how many UE hours do you have? He'll come right back and tell you. UE stands for unit equipped. That's the airplane you're flying right now, the one that's in your unit. How many UE hours do you have? 1965, fighter force that was in Southeast Asia, either TDY deployed or they're stationed there for 1-year tours or 100 mission tours. The average was 1,000 hours. Okay, got any former fighter squadron commanders in here? Anybody want to raise their hand? Oh, I'll raise my hand. I'd have killed to have 1,000 hours average in my squadron when I was a squadron commander in 1986. That's a lot of UE time. And think, now I said average, right? So there's lots of 1,500, 2,000 hour guys and lots of 700, 800 hour guys. In those days, a fighter pilot was considered to be experienced when he had 1,000 hours. Today, it's 500. We couldn't make the standard, so we lowered it. The typical Air Force response, right? So, but that was 1965. By 1972, which was the big linebacker campaigns, that ultimately the air war ended shortly after that in January of 73, just 7 years later, the UE time had dropped to 250 hours. 1,000 hours to 250 hours. Now, how did that happen? Well, that happened as an unintended consequence of a decision made by the Air Force, approved by the Air Force Chief of Staff, Joseph McConnell, that said that if you're a pilot in the Air Force, you don't have to serve 2 non-voluntary tours to Vietnam until every pilot in the Air Force, not fighter pilot, every pilot in the Air Force has served 1. All right? So what that meant is that by 1969, 1970, 4 to 5 years in the war, all the experienced fighter pilots, this 1,000 UE guys, they'd all done their tours and they're off enjoying their life. And now what we have coming into the fighters are bomber pilots, transport pilots, reconnaissance pilots, and training pilots. So they might have 3,000 or 4,000 hours in B-58s, but they've got 50 hours in the F-4. All right? So the demographic changed dramatically during that time period. The second thing that changed during that time period, and this was also, that was the negative side. Here's the plus side. Took a while for it to be realized, but it was a plus side. From 1960 to 1970, the Air Force had a total changeover in the educational level of its officer corps. In 1960, you could still be commissioned as an officer in the Air Force with a high school diploma if you went through aviation cadets, right? That program stopped in 1963, I believe. Because about 1961 or 1962, federal law changed saying that to be commissioned in the services, you had to have a bachelor's degree, right? What that meant in the demographic of the Air Force was that during those years, and I'm rounding these numbers off, okay, but not by much. From 1960 to 1970, we went from an officer corps in the Air Force that had 80% high school diplomas and 20% college diplomas to exactly the opposite. 80% with bachelor's degrees and 20% with high school diplomas. And that 20% withered away very quickly after 1970 because many of them didn't get promoted. So they retired at 20 years. And aviation cadets stopped. All right. So what impact did that have on the Air Force? Well, my hypothesis is that it had a dramatic effect on the Air Force. What is it we learn in college? Put you on the spot. No, I'm not, because nobody likes to be put on the spot in front of 50 other people. I'll tell you what we learn in college. We learn critical thinking skills. That's what we learn. You might be a biology major, you might be an English major like I was, you might be a history major, you might be a psychology major, but what you're really learning in college is critical thinking skills. How to compare one thing against another, how to measure something, see the result, change one of the knowns, and get a different result. Right? That's what you learn in college, whether it be how to write a sentence or how to mix 3 chemicals together. So by 1970, we have a lot of our officers now are looking at things differently than the way their predecessors had looked at them. I can tell you from interviewing many pilots older than I, and there aren't many around anymore that are older than I am, but back when I was young, I interviewed guys, and let me tell you what they did when somebody had a problem. Let's say a fighter pilot in P-51s, he had a problem learning how to do a certain maneuver in the air. I asked a guy once who flew P-51s, who had been a commander in P-51s, well, what'd you do with a guy like that? And he said, we just flew him 4 times a day until he got it right. Okay, that's good. That's good. Guess what? We don't even fly 4 times a week, let alone 4 times a day. So we have to come up with better ways to do this training. And these guys with these critical thinking skills, they start coming up with better ways to do that. The very first changes that we saw in our fighter force were in weapons, and those were during the war. They actually started off during the war, so it's kind of a lie for me to say in the decade after Vietnam. These changes started during the war. You know, there is a former Secretary of Defense who infamously, in my view, said, you fight with the army you bring to war. He couldn't have been more wrong. America has never fought that way, ever. Every war we fought, we've changed on the fly as we've gone. And you can look at all the different versions of the B-17 in World War II, the versions of the P-51 in World War II. I'm sure you Navy and Army guys can come up with just as many examples for your services that I can come up with mine. And Vietnam was no exception. We went through 3 changes to the AIM-7 during the war, ending up with what we called the dogfight AIM-7, cleverly named. Why was that? Because the old AIM-7 used to burn its motor and just go a long ways before it started to guide. All right? Well, and it had to do that because it can only carry so much flight control fluid in that system, and it had to go out there a long ways. Well, guess what? When we shoot an AIM-7 and a MiG-17 doing a turn that's only got about a 1,500-foot turn radius circle in it, and that missile doesn't start to guide until it's halfway there, it never can make the corner. So we have this dogfight missile that comes off the rail, and as soon as it gets safely clear of the shooting airplane, it starts to guide right now. AIM-9, the same way. We went through 3 major versions of the AIM-9. The IR guided missile, the Sidewinder, on the fly. We made it sleeker, we made it faster, we made it more aerodynamic, we made it much more highly maneuverable, all because we're fighting low altitude targets. We made the same kind of changes in the weapons that we dropped. We went through 2 changes. First, the revolution, and I could give a whole lecture on this and I won't, of laser guided bombs. We brought laser-guided bombs on the F-4, started employing them in combat in 1968, late 1968, 1969. By 1970, only 2 years later, we had a podded designator that we could carry in a pod on the airplane that was it was more powerful and it was certainly more aerodynamic. And we used 8 airplanes to bring down the Than Hoa Bridge that had stood against hundreds and hundreds of F-105 bombing attacks with dumb bombs. We did it with 4 F-4s with laser designators. And the Air Force fell in love with laser-guided bombs. And we went through 4 more laser-type designators in the next 8 years. during this period after Vietnam until we got to the point now where we have several different kinds. Everybody carries them, even B-52s carry them. Guys on the ground carry them. I mean, it was a whole thing. Okay, I'm off my topic, all right? I'm coming back to it. So we changed our munitions as well dramatically, and LGBs and AIM-7s and AIM-9s are only a couple, 3 examples. Other kinds of things changed also. Anti-armor weapons particularly because of the Warsaw Pact. The next thing to start to change was training. Trainings for the Air Force and the Navy, training was changing right at the end of the war. We've all seen Top Gun. We all know the Top Gun story. Air Force was doing the same thing. And what we learned, all of the services, what we learned was that all this fighting F4 against F4 was not only good training, it was counterproductive training. It was negative training. So what we did is we looked around and we said, what do we have in the inventory that's the same size as a MiG-21? That was the primary fighter, obviously, primary officer. What in the inventory do we have that has smokeless engines like the MiG-21? What do we have in the airplane in the inventory that has kind of the same cockpit visibility out the back as a MiG-21? What do we have in inventory that's cheap to operate like the MiG-21? The T-38. And if I did bring one PowerPoint slide, I could put a picture of a T-38 up here, right? We had T-38s, which were the supersonic frontline Air Force pilot training trainer, and we had hundreds of them, right? So we formed an Aggressor squadron at Nellis one year, 1972, followed very shortly in 1973 by a second one, which was, and their mission was to be Russian pilots. That was their mission. To think like Russian pilots, to fight like Russian pilots, maybe even drink like Russian pilots. No, nobody could drink like a Russian pilot. To teach academics like a Russian, and to fly Russian tactics. Okay, why? I'll give you one example. Check left and extend. We had reached the point by 1973 where our primary air-to-air formation was F4s line abreast, 6,000 feet apart. And you do these rehearsed things first as a young guy, you learn, right? Rehearsed things. So we have an F4 attack this left guy, for example, out from 9,000 feet, coming into missile range, which is like 6,000 or 8,000 feet. And the idea there is for the guy over here, he can see this guy 6 o'clock, to tell him to, the tactic is check left, which is a hard turn that moves your vulnerable cone away from the attacker, and then unload to 0G and full afterburner and extend. Get more airspeed, try to get some separation, because we could, one good thing about the F4, we could out-accelerate anybody, right? Even proof positive that given big enough engines, even a brick will go supersonic. That's the F4. So we would do that. And guess what? As soon as this guy would do his check left and extend, he'd look over his shoulder, and there's this F4 attacking him, which has a frontal surface. I can't even get my arms far enough apart to say how big an F4 is on the frontal surface. And the engines put out big black smoke trail. Okay, that's great. And then he would defend himself. Well, guess what happened? We do that against the T-38. He'd go, turn, extend, look over his shoulder. I don't see nothing. Because an T-38's like a MiG-21. It's about this big on the front. And no smoke. And the T-38 would just taxi in and say, bang, you're dead. You know? We were learning the wrong things by fighting each other. So by getting the aggressors, we now started to learn how to fight against the kind of adversary that we were really going to fight against. And it changed everything. It changed our tactics. It changed our formations. It changed a lot of our radio calls, how we talked on the radio. We call it the brevity code. Changed everything. Changed crew coordination in the F4 between the front seater and the back seater. Changed everything that we did in about 3 years. It all changed, every bit of it. everything. It was all new after that. Well, another huge advance that we made in training was the advent of red flag. Books, entire books have been written about the advent of red flag. I'm going to just very briefly touch on why red flag. Red flag is a very simple mission: to give a pilot his first combat missions without anybody shooting real bullets at him, or her in these days, right? By the way, guys now in the new Webster's is gender neutral, so all right, so I get to say guys. They get the whole thing in 10 missions. How do they do that? They come to Nellis on a weekend, Nellis Air Force Base out in Las Vegas, Nevada, where they have huge amounts of airspace, and threat replicators, SA-2 transmitters, SA-3 transmitters, SA-6 transmitters, fire can, 57 millimeter gun transmitters, all that stuff. All sorts of target arrays, airfields, armored convoys, you name it, everything in an area that's like 90 miles by 40 miles, something like that. It's about right, isn't it? Pretty good training. They come in on the weekend, they start off walk before you run. Monday's mission is an orientation. Tuesday's mission is kind of a walkthrough of a combat kind of mission, until you get to the Friday of the second week, and it's all no holds barred. It's everything. It's all the missiles, it's all the aggressors, it's all the red air, it's chaff, it's flares, it's laser guided bombs, it's ECM, it's B-52s mixed in, it's C-141s doing airdrops, it's facts, it's a guy shot down over here who's talking on the radio so you can't hear what the hell's going on. I mean, it's all there, every bit of it. All of it. And every pilot gets to come do that. Every air crew, I shouldn't say pilot because now it grows once it starts. The first one's December 1975. It grows. By 1980, you've got SAC bombers, you've got Mac airlift airplanes, you've got the Navy just beating us to death to get in there and fly red flag with us, which they do in huge numbers. And the Marines. Never forget the Marines. All right? So, I mean, this is a big thing. And the idea, again, is to get this guy 10 missions under his belt before he actually goes to combat. All right, now, the critical thinking skills and documentation just a little bit. And by the way, a little note that I made here on red flag. I cannot overemphasize the importance of what we learn in red flag from Navy, Marine, and Air Force guys going out to do a mission with bombers, reconnaissance, command and control, comm jamming, and all those things together. We really got a feel, and red flag really still to this day teaches this multi-force coordination, which is so important to success. All right, and then in training, gun cameras and ACMI. The F-4 was a fighter, the first fighter the Air Force ever bought that didn't have a gun camera since World War II. Didn't have a gun camera. Why? Because you're going to shoot missiles out of visual range, so what do you need a gun camera for? It did have a radar scope camera on the back radar display that you could film your radar display, but it didn't have a gun camera. Guess what? In our Vietnam experience, only 10% of the radar-guided missiles that we fired actually hit their target. All right? And it was about 15% for our IR guided missiles, Sidewinders. Well, some of that is because of, this is the only MiG I'm ever going to see because they didn't fly a lot, so I'm going to shoot everything I've got on the airplane at it. All right? So that was some of it. But because we analyzed every shot, we gathered all that data, interesting concept, data, which had never been in the Air Force much before in the fighter force, we realized that the vast predominance of those missiles missed because they were fired out of the missile's performance parameter. They never had a chance. They came off the airplane, they never had a chance. They were too close, too far, too much angle, whatever, all sorts of things, right? So we started putting gun cameras in our airplanes. The F-4 was post-modified or modified with a gun camera. The T-38 gave way to the F-5. We had 4 squadrons of F-5s ready to go to Vietnam in 1975. Well, what happened in 1975? No more Vietnam. Well, at least no more South Vietnam, right? So we took those 4 F-5 squadrons and we gave 2 squadrons to the 2 Nellis Aggressor squadrons. We started an Aggressor squadron in Europe, and we started an Aggressor squadron in the Pacific. So we had Aggressors for everybody, right? And they were flying the F-5, which was an even better replicator of the MiG-21 than the T-38 was. I won't go into why. It was a little bit better. But it had a gun camera. As soon as we put gun cameras in F-5s and F-4s, guess what we found out? Nobody can lie like himself. Nobody can lie better than a fighter pilot to himself about what he just did. All right? That's what we found out. That's what we learned. Oh, yeah, man, I got 3 great kills on this guy. There's the film, and guess what? Not a single one of them was in parameters. Not one. That was the advent of the $5 rule. These guys said in the weapons school, when you fly a weapons school mission, if you take a shot and you call a kill on a guy and he has to leave the fight, you show your film. Don't have any film? That'll be $5. You have the film and it's out of parameters? That's $5. And it was, law. You had to show your film or it did not count. This is critical thinking skills applied, right? Take a measurement, look at the measurement, see what it does, take the measurement and plug it back into what you're doing and make an improvement. So at any rate, then the big change, of course, for us, Navy invented a thing called ACMI. They call it ACMR, Air Combat Maneuvering Instrumentation Range. That's where you carry a pod on your airplane. You've seen it in Top Gun, right? The little airplanes, you know what they just did? Scooting around. Well, the Air Force bought that. We thought that was pretty cool. You could come back and sit down with a pilot that you'd just flown a mission with in air-to-air. And my belief, I was an instructor at the Fighter Weapons School when we started using ACMI. I could teach him from 1 mission on ACMI as much as I could teach him in 5 missions in the air, because he could see what his airplane was doing relative to my airplane. All right, well, this is pretty good because we're not flying 4 times a day anymore. We're flying 4 times a week. So these things made huge advances and our tactics got very finely tuned. And of course, then we come into the aircraft. The aircraft, the F-15, the F-16, the A-10, all came in that 10-year period. The F-15 first. By the way, everybody says, oh my God, the B-52 is so old. Guess what this year is? This year is the 40th anniversary of the first operational F-15 squadron. This year right now, all right? Okay, so F-15 came. I'm going to very quickly touch because I want to leave time for questions and answers at the end. Number 1, you've seen them, big bubble canopy. Guess what? When I'm maneuvering, I can turn like this in the cockpit of an F-15 and look right between my own tails. All right? I can look right down the spine of my airplane and my own tails. Fighter pilots definitely were in the design on this because on the canopy rail, welded to the canopy rail, are these 2 heavy wire handles. We call them towel racks. Take a hold of it with your hand, pull yourself around in the seat. You say, well, who's flying? I am, because I do it left-handed, right? When I'm doing this way, right? Take a hold of it, pull yourself around in the seat. They thought of everything in this airplane. Everything that works in the F-15 is based on the Vietnam combat experience. Every single thing. I flew that airplane for a year before I stopped saying, oh, they got this right. Oh, they got this right. Oh, they got this right. All the switches are on the stick and the throttle. Everything. Once you take off, and certainly when you're fighting, from the point where you say fights on, and you start fighting, you never have to take your hand off the stick of the throttles, ever. All the missile, it's called playing the piccolo. There's like 9 over here and 5 over here. And they do everything for the weapons. Everything, for the radar, for the weapons, for flares and chaff, for everything. You never have to take your hands off the stick and the throttle. Okay, F-16 is the same thing. F-16, the purest day VFR fighter ever built. Now, I never flew the F-16, but I fought them a lot. Okay? Okay, time for a quick joke to lighten things up a little bit. Two pilots are standing in the bar. It's World War II. They're in London drinking in a pub. One's a Mustang pilot, P-51, and the other one's a RAF Spitfire pilot. And they're arguing about who has the better fighter, flies the better fighter. And finally, the RAF guy slams his mug down in the bar and he says to the American Mustang jock, "All right, mate, I'll meet you anywhere tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock and we'll have this out. Guns hot, you and me, one-on-one." The Mustang pilot looks at him and says, "Okay, high noon over Berlin." And the Spitfire pilot says, "But I can't get to Berlin." The Mustang pilot says, "I win." Okay? So F-16, if I was going to have representative combat one-on-one against Putin's best guy, I'd have my best guy in an F-16 meet him. Sorry, I'm discounting the F-22 and the F-35 in this discussion. I'm talking about in my day. Over the Washington Monument at 10,000 feet, and I guarantee the winner right now the same way that Joe Namath guaranteed the win in the Super Bowl. Absolutely, hands down, right? Now, if you say to me, okay, tomorrow the fight's going to be someplace in the world within a 24-hour clock in an unknown weather condition, then I'm going to send the F-15, right? Because I know the F-15 is always going to beat him if it's at night. He's always going to beat him if the weather is bad. He's always going to beat him if it's low altitude, da-da-da-da-da. And he'll probably still beat him in the clear day VFR air mass as well, all right? And the A-10. We're all reading in the papers about the A-10. The A-10 is the finest airplane that the Air Force ever designed. It can do exactly what it was intended to do, which is to take battle damage. That was a joke. Great airplane. And you can see all the same if you read about the A-10. Hey, it's just a flying gun, right? We learned we needed to have this anti-armor thing, right? Okay, so that's it. Tactics, training, and weapons in that decade after Vietnam. Changed the way the Air Force looks at its fighter force, changed the way the Air Force employs its fighter force, changed everything within the fighter force. And we have some time for questions. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, I was curious to note that you didn't mention the theories on air combat of Colonel John Boyd, who's often given credit for the ideas that went into the F-16, the F-15, etc. Did you have any direct experience with those theories, and can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. Okay, so John Boyd came up with a concept called energy maneuverability, which is measuring an airplane's potential energy level against its actual energy level. And you can diagram out the performance of a MiG, diagram out the performance of an F-4, you can overlay them over each other, and you can see where the F-4 has its advantages and where the MiG-21 has its advantages. It really revolutionized, and it was, again, these critical thinking skills that then came, that he proposed, that came to us. And, of course, he had a lot to do with the design. I didn't mention him because he was an irascible old fart, and every time I talked to him, we got into an argument. So, but John Boyd had a tremendous impact on the design of the F-15 and the F-16 as well, and you can read Corum's book about Boyd and get some of that. Take it with a grain of salt, but it was good. And yeah, great contributor. And I taught Boyd's course when I was at the weapons school. Yeah. I mean, he came up with all that in the late 50s, right? And I was still teaching that energy maneuverability course in the weapons school in 1980 when I left there. And I'm sure they still do in some part or another. Yeah, we still teach the course. Or we used to, at least, when I was there. Yes, sir.
Was there a drastic evolution in IFF, identification friend and foe, during this time period too, or not?
No. We have the same IFF now that we had right today. In our own airplanes, we have. Let me back off of that. I haven't flown a fighter for 15 years. All right. But I can tell you that for at least the next 30 years, we had the same IFF. The only thing that changed, we had, the mode 1, the mode 2, the mode 3, altitude, and we had mode 4A and 4B, which was encrypted for the time of day that you were flying. And then we had and mode 2, which was set one time that identified the actual aircraft itself. The only thing that changed was, and it was a great change, was they put it in the F-15 and the F-16, they put it right up at eye level where you could change it without looking down beside your right hip.
Are you ever afraid of the U.S. air defenses?
When I was at Bitburg flying F-15s, I was a squadron commander there, and just north of the field we had a Hawk battery, and just south of the field we had a Hawk battery, and it did disconcert me at times because we would have to turn right over that Hawk battery to come down to the overhead landing pattern for Bitburg, and you fly over them and you see, could you guys practice on somebody else, please? I mean, you know, I hope the red guarded switch is tied down or whatever, yeah. Yes, always. And we had safe passage corridors for wartime where you had to fly a certain ground track to come back and land because those electronic things do fail and people do make mistakes. And we have seen mistakes made in the past, yeah. But I'll tell you right now, Air Force fighter pilots have shot down more of each other than any Army guys have ever shot down Air Force. Because we've had a lot of guys think they had a training missile when it was a live missile and say, oh, damn, boo, that's going to leave a mark. Yeah. Yes, sir.
If the change between the mid-'70s and the mid-'80s was either evolutionary or even revolutionary, would you say that same kind of change exists today, where we've gone from a previous way of fighting the war in the air to maybe a different way, and again, based on critical thought?
Yeah. You know, I'm not really qualified to answer that, but I won't evade it. I'll try to answer it. You know, so again, remember now, I flew my last F-15 sortie 17 years ago now. But I do go to the fighter bar on Friday night, so I hear the talk. I think that the 5th generation airplanes are really changing everything, but I don't think we've really gotten our arms around it yet, and I don't think we'll get our arms around it until we get the F-35 in the inventory to fly with the F-22 to see, in the same battle space, to see how it's all going to tie together. But I can tell you that the F-22, a lot of the things that we couldn't mechanize or computerize in the F-15 have been mechanized and automated. Automated is a better word in the F-22. Where I had to do a considerable amount of radar interpretation of what I was seeing about what direction targets were going, what altitudes they were at, what kind of airplane they were, and all that sort of thing, all automated in the F-22. And so the pilot's workload, you know, fighter pilot's workload never decreases, it always increases. You know, an F-86 guy he's busy in the cockpit, you know. F-22 guy, he's just as busy. I mean, he's not sitting there sipping his water bottle, watching missiles go off and whatever. So it's still busy. And I'll tell you that the young kids coming into the Air Force today have those kinds of skills that we never had. I mean, when I was still flying, I used to have to go twice a week and sit in a computer screen with the switches and play the piccolo just to keep up with the kids, because to them it was second nature. You're nodding your head. To them it's second nature. It's just one more step past Hijack 3 or whatever hell games as they play these days. But I'm not sure we really know. I think that's our big step, but we've only got a part of the puzzle in place yet. I don't think we know all of it yet. Yes, sir. One of you.
Do you think that the A-10 retirement is premature, or under ideal conditions will you continue to utilize the A-10 for a few more years, or is there a plan in inventory, or will be soon, that can truly replace it?
He's asking me, for those of you who can't hear, if I think that the A-10 retirement is premature, and do we have something that can replace it in the future? Here's what I know. I know that the A-10 is the best close air support airplane ever built since the Stuka. I know that it has tremendous capacity for close air support and search and rescue. I know that it has very limited, here's an A-10 guy standing right over here, sitting right over here. A-10 squadron commander, former squadron commander right there. I also know that it has limited air-to-air capacity, and it has limited other kind of mission deep interdiction capacity. So I know that if dollars are limited and the budget is small, where the Air Force is going to lean towards making a decision that gives as much capacity and as much flexibility as it can. Now, I would never in a million years say an F-35 is ever going to be able to do close air support as well as an A-10. That's a fool's argument to say that, because I just said it was the best one ever made since the Stuka, right? You know, but when you're making these decisions, it's like the argument between single seat and two seat. You know, the Navy and the Air Force both have gone back, and the Marines have gone back. See, I always remember the Marines at the end. Have gone back and forth for decades over the fighters have one cockpit or two cockpits, and both services have fluctuated between the two things. The question isn't whether or not two men in the airplane is better than one. I'm here to tell you, I've flown I've flown the F4 two-seat, I've flown the F-15 single seat, I've flown the F-15 two-seat. I'm here to tell you that in a dogfight, it's better to have a backseater. It's another set of eyes and there's someone to break down some of the combat things. But that isn't the question. The question is one good enough? Is a single seat good enough? And the question here is the F-35 good enough? I don't have an answer to that. That we'll have to find out, I think. Did I tap dance around that well enough? All right, Randy.
You just raised the question, though, about the transition from two seats to one. How did that change how pilots trained and how they relied upon what they were able to do themselves and how much they had to work with others because there was nobody in the back after 1975 or 1980?
Yeah, well, could you hear him back there? He's asking me, you know, how did we compensate for the fact when we went from the F-4 to the F-15 we didn't have a backseater? Automation. I mean, the radar was so much easier to run because of computerized automation. And, you know, in the original F-15A, we had a 32K computer. 32K computer. I remember when I was at Bitburg in 1984, we got the 64K computers. 64K. I mean, that's not even like what's in a Casio. 64K. We were in hog heaven when we got those 64K computers in our airplanes. But it was so easy to operate alone but again, I'll tell you right now, I'm going in the dogfight. If I'm going close in dogfight, I'd really like to have that backseater back there. But again, the question is it better? Of course it's better. You'd be a fool to say that two sets of eyes in the fight aren't better than one set of eyes. All right? You'd be nuts to say that. But the question is one good enough? I think the F-15 is, 107 to nothing right now? So I think it's probably proven itself pretty well. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, Dan Miller, Army ITA. You know, you talked a lot about design, and you know, for the Phantom drivers, the Eagle drivers. And in former life, I was a Phantom fixer and an Eagle keeper.
Okay, all right.
And you talked about it was weapons order. So you said, hey, they got this right on the F-15. And definitely, when I moved from F-4s to F-15s, the design was superb. They got it right. So as you look at the whole weapons system,
Good point.
it was everything.
Good
I
point.
think they definitely got it right.
I'll give you for example. In the F-4, it has a battery, right? Like a car battery. Guess where it is? It's under the rear ejection seat. So if the battery has to be changed, you have to take the canopy off, take the ejection seat out, change the battery, put it all back together. Guess where the battery, trick question, guess where the battery is in the F-15? It doesn't have a battery. It doesn't have one at all. Okay? So, I mean, yeah, from a maintainer's viewpoint as well. And you know, you load the F-4 like this, right? You load the F-15 like this. Okay? So, I mean, yeah, we could just go on and on comparing notes about the improvements that were made in those two airplanes. Yes, sir. Who's next? I've exhausted? No.
Could you talk about the evolution of cockpit displays and their impact on
Yeah, sure. He asked me if I talk about the evolution of cockpit displays. Yeah, and I have a joke about that as well. Okay, so in the F-86, you had a gun sight, right? It had a radar in the later models that would compute, you know, lead, based on how hard the target was turning, and based on how hard you were turning, and it would compute lead, and that was it. In the F4, we had this F4C. We didn't have that. Why? Because it didn't have a gun, right? So we just had a fixed reticle out the front, right? Then when we got the F4D, we got a computing reticle, and it would show you range to the target. We got to the F15, and the heads-up display, it was all there, including some very bright shoot cues that would tell you when you were within the parameters of the missile you had selected. For the maneuver of the target, your maneuver, the range aspect, all those things all factored in. It was fantastic. And you could not only know when you were within range, you could know when you were in the sweet spot where the missile had a very high probability of hitting the target. So if you could wait based on a tactical situation, you could sweeten it up. It was all there. Heading, aspect, altitude, airspeed, Gs, number of bullets left, number of missiles left, all of it displayed up there on the HUD. It was absolutely fantastic. Well, I was still in the F4 when the F-15 came out. F-15 came out in 1970. I didn't leave the F4 until 1980 when I came to the Pentagon for a staff tour. So we said, we want that. We want that. And so the guys at England came up with a thing, and they came up and briefed us on it. And they put 2 lights up on the canopy bow, like right up here. And when you were within the proper parameters for the missile you had selected, those lights would flash, right? And they called it the SIDS system. And it was an acronym, SYDS, SIDS. Shoot, you dumb shit. No, seriously, that's what it stood for, okay? So we went from this to having it all right there on the heads-up display. And of course now in the F-35, it's all here. No matter where you look, all that information is in front of you. Which I'm not sure what you do with it, but yes, sir.
I'd be too offensive with this question, but since one of the biggest limiters right now in the inventory is the human in the vehicle, do you think that you will replace a part of the inventory with UAVs, or do you think that that should?
Could you hear that?
Are we going to replace the fighter inventory? I think is what you're asking me. Fighter inventory with unmanned aircraft? I don't think we'll see in my lifetime UAVs take over the classical air defense and air interdiction kind of mission, because we can't get enough in the airplane that we already have in here, and it's too expensive. I was the commander of all the target drone guys down at Tyndall on one of my lifetimes, and I can tell you that operating, some of you know this already, many of you know this, operating unmanned systems is incredibly expensive, right? And you don't save any manpower. In fact, you add manpower. So I think for niche things, what we need to ask ourselves with an unmanned airplane is, what does this unmanned airplane bring to the table that a manned airplane doesn't bring to the table? And of course, one thing is persistence, you know? And I talked to a U-2 guy that's been in the cockpit for 18 to 20 hours at a time, and they'll tell you, you know, one thing is persistence. So that's what we have to ask ourselves. So I think we'll see them continue to develop in niches, but I just don't see the capacity to be able to put all the defensive systems, all the offensive systems, all the whatever in the airplane that are already here. So we'll see. Yes, sir. Okay, last question.
Last question, yeah.
Okay. You talked in the education piece about you kind of had an old guard and a new guard, this shift of 20. So I'm sure that there were friction between those groups as the transition occurred.
There was.
So I see kind of the same thing happening today with, we're old guard and the millennial generation coming in. I'm sure we'll see some of those same things. Any words of wisdom about how to manage that process?
Did you hear what he asked me back there? Well, that's a damn good question, because there is that friction. There's no question about that. And there always is, right? It's a father-son friction, really, is what it is. I can tell you what succeeded when I was on the other side of the coin, when I was young and my belly was flat and my vision was clear, was persistence. It was persistence. And of course, we had that Vietnam experience too. And I was going to say something else, but I won't because we're over our time. But I think that in our world of total knowledge of email and internet stuff, I think that supervisors and commanders need to take a step back and let these kids be creative and understand they're going to have failures. Just keep them from getting hit by a truck. You know, don't let them do something really big and dumb, but you've got to turn them loose. That's what's really made our military great, innovation, really. That's what makes Americans great. You know, there's a great book out there by Dinesh. What makes America great? I know. What makes America great? And you know what his answer is? His answer is that Americans aren't afraid to be self-critical. We look at ourselves and we say, man, we screwed that up. You know, let's make that better. And we have to, I think we need to step back away from micromanagement on a data. It's easy. Step back and let them be creative. Just don't let them make any big mistakes that are really going to hurt them bad, but let them make other mistakes. Yes, okay, Aaron.
On behalf of the OSD and all the DoD history programs, I'd like to thank you for your very captivating talk.
Oh,
we have a small token.
you're so kind. Thank you very much.
Please join me.
That's real. Thanks, Aaron.